Monster City Madhouse, a year-round online store full of Halloween and classic horror shirts, with an emphasis on the vintage look. Use code SAVE10 for 10% off your order. MonsterCityMadhouse.com. Free shipping and financing's available. Welcome back to Southern Ghost Stories. I am the American Haunt Historian, Alan Searcy. Glad you guys are with me. I got a fun show today about a haunted courthouse in Louisiana. But first, I had the big giveaway back in January. I was trying to get reviews for the podcast, and I wanted to pick the winners, let you guys know. I've already reached out to them on Facebook, but I'll go ahead and announce them here. Shelley Andrews, Sonia Roller, Melissa Cromwell, John Roberts, and Patsy Clemens. You all have books coming your way. I've reached out to you on Facebook. I've actually corresponded with a few of you. One person wanted Fear and Folklore, American Witches. One asked for Hexed. One asked for Southern Ghost Stories, South Nashville, which kind of surprised me. But hey, that's where I grew up. It's a fun book. But anyway, yeah. And speaking of the books, check out the books. They're all on Amazon. They're all on Audible, on Kindle, all that good stuff. If you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read them online. Also, the Audible thing, I do have all the books on Audible, but they are the AI robot voice, I've been told. Sometimes it sounds good, sometimes it doesn't. Funny story, I've actually reached out. I hired 2 voice actors over the past, I guess it's 2-3 years ago, to start converting the books over to Audible. This is before the AI robot voice came into play. And I hired 2 of them. Both were very good, very talented voice artists. Well, they both flaked out on me. So I kind of gave up on that, and yeah, they're on Audible now, but it is the AI voice, which some people like, some people don't. Give or take, just give it a shot. Anyway, well, let's get into the show. So, most hauntings are vague. You hear a floorboard creak, or you see a shadow out of the corner of your eye and convince yourself it's just the wind. But the basement of the Calcasieu Parish Courthouse in Lake Charles, Louisiana, that's different. People who work there don't talk about ghosts like they're in a Victorian novel. They talk about the strange smell. They talk about the distinct, cloying scent of the 1940s era dime store perfume. And they talk about the sound of a woman's heels clicking on the concrete where the quote-unquote big switch was thrown. Today, we're talking about Toni Jo Henry. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. And she wasn't a misunderstood hero. She was a woman who committed a brutal, cold-blooded execution for a getaway car. But the way she died, and the fact that she was the only woman in Louisiana ever put in an electric chair, it burned her into the limestone of that courthouse forever. To understand why a woman would execute a stranger in a rice field, you have to look at the grit she was raised in. Before the headlines called her the Tiger Woman, she was just Annie Beatrice McQuiston. She was born into a life that was rigged against her from day one. Her mother died of consumption, which we call tuberculosis, back when Annie was 6. Her father was an alcoholic who couldn't or wouldn't protect her. And by the time she was a teenager in Shreveport, she wasn't going to school. She was working in the quote-unquote sporting district on Fannin Street. And this wasn't the glamorous version of the oldest profession. It was the Fannin Street of the 1930s. Loud, violent, and fueled by cheap gin and narcotics. By the time Annie was 19, she was a functional heroin addict, using the drug to numb the reality of her surroundings. She changed her name to Toni Jo, a name that sounded tougher, kind of like in armor. Then she met Claude Henry. Everyone called him Cowboy, and it wasn't just because of the hat. He had this restless Western energy, a guy who looked like he was constantly looking for a fight or a fast exit. He was actually a professional lightweight boxer, and by all accounts, he's pretty good. He was fast, he was chiseled, and he had that magnetic, dangerous charisma that draws people in like a moth to a blowtorch. You ever seen the girls around the UFC fighters? They love that stuff. They love a tough macho man. Well, for Toni Jo, Beating Cowboy was like finally stepping out of the shadows of Pannon Street. You have to remember, she had spent years being used to men who saw her as a commodity. Cowboy saw her as a partner. He treated her like royalty, or at least his version of it. He was her exit strategy, because he represented a life where she was protected. But the irony of Cowboy Henry is that the man she relied on for protection was the most volatile man in any room. Cowboy's temper, it wasn't a character flaw. It was undoing. The incident in Beaumont, Texas wasn't some calculated hit. It was an explosion of ego and adrenaline. He was in a bar in Beaumont, in the kind of place where the air is thick with smoke and bad intentions. And he got into a brawl over something silly, something meaningless. But Claude didn't just throw a punch. He threw a killing blow. When you're a professional fighter, your hands are lethal weapons. In the state of Texas, they took that literally. He was convicted of murder and slapped with a 50-year sentence at the Huntsville Walls Unit. Now, think about that from Toni Jo's perspective. She finally finds her savior, her future husband. And before the ink is even dry on the marriage certificate, he's being hauled off to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Well, but the grit of the relationship doesn't end with a sentence. While Claude was in Huntsville, he wasn't exactly a model prisoner. He was a man obsessed with getting back to Toni Jo. Listen to this. He actually managed to escape from a prison farm at one point, and that's almost impossible to do. But he got caught and was dragged back. And that's what fueled Toni Jo's desperation. She didn't just love him, she was addicted to him. She saw him as a caged animal, and she blamed the world for putting him there. In her mind, the law hadn't taken her husband. It had taken her future. That's why she didn't wait for him. She decided that if Cowboy could try to break out for her, she would break in for him. She wasn't just a wife anymore. She was an insurgent. And the next man who crossed her path wasn't a person to her. He was just a set of keys to Cowboy's cell. She didn't see a prison sentence. She saw a temporary obstacle. She began obsessing over a jailbreak. She had to break him out. But she needed two things she didn't really have: a partner and a car. So she found herself a partner in a Shreveport dive bar. His name was Harold Burks, but they called him Arky. Arky, he was a drifter, an ex-con, and frankly, he wasn't the brightest light in the harbor. He was the kind of guy who followed orders if they were spoken loudly enough. Toni Jo manipulated him with ease, convincing him that they were going to be the next Bonnie and Clyde. So, on Valentine's Day week, 1940, they set out. They had no money. They had no vehicle. All they had was a single .32 caliber revolver tucked into Toni Jo's bag and a plan to hitchhike their way to the Huntsville gates. They stood on the side of the highway outside Shreveport. Toni Jo used her looks to flag down a ride. And they weren't looking for a ride to Texas. They were hunting for a victim who had a car reliable enough to make a high-speed getaway from a prison camp. And that's when a Ford V8 pulled over, driven by a man named Joseph Calloway. He thought he was doing a favor for a pretty girl and her friend. He had no idea he had just invited his own executioners into the back seat. So they got picked up near Jennings, and the guy who picked him up was Joseph Calloway. And Calloway, he was a mild-mannered salesman. He was just trying to get home. Well, Toni Jo and Arky, they hijacked him at gunpoint. They drove him to a desolate rice field outside of Lake Charles. They made Calloway get out. They make him strip to his underwear so he can't run far in the winter cold. Then Toni Jo leads him to a haystack. She doesn't hesitate. She puts a .32 to his head and pulls a trigger. Twice. They leave his body in the dirt, take his car, and head for the border. They didn't even make it to the prison. The car broke down. They got spooked, and eventually they were caught. The devotion that fueled the crime was real, but so was the blood on her hands. When she was arrested, Toni Jo didn't cry. She wisecracked. She posed for photos. She became a celebrity. The legal battle that followed wasn't a quick open and shut case. It was a 2-year marathon of psychological warfare and tabloid frenzy. There were 3 separate trials because the state kept tripping over its own feet. And every time they went back to the court, the legend of Toni Jo, it only grew. And you have to picture the scene. The courtroom is packed. The air is thick with humidity and cigarette smoke. And in the middle of it all sits Toni Jo. She's petite, and she has these perfectly coiffed dark curls. And she's dressed like she's going on a Sunday social rather than a murder trial. She was a master of the optics. She sat there with this eerie, detached calm, sometimes even flashing a coy smile at the photographers from the New Orleans Item or the Associated Press. She wasn't playing the hysterical woman card. She was playing the femme fatale, and it drove the public wild. People were divided. Half the state wanted to save the pretty girl, and the other half wanted to see the tiger woman paid for the blood in that rice field. So, by late 1942, the legal battle for Toni Jo Henry had reached its breaking point. For 2 years, she'd been a permanent fixture there in the headlines. The petite, curly-haired tiger woman who sat calmly through 3 separate trials. But the Louisiana Supreme Court eventually shut the door on her appeals for good. And the date was set for execution, November 28, 1942. But as the clock ticked down in Lake Charles, a different kind of drama was unfolding 150 miles away in Huntsville, Texas. The cowboy, remember him, Claude Henry? He was rotting in a cell in the Walls unit, and he wasn't about to let the state take his wife without a fight. 4 days before Toni Jo was scheduled to walk to that chair, Cowboy did the impossible. He escaped. You have to understand, Huntsville wasn't a place people just walked out of. It was one of the most secure facilities in the South, known as the Walls, because of the massive brick perimeter that felt like a fortress. But Cowboy was driven by a level of raw desperation that most people can't fathom. He didn't have a plan for a new life. He had a plan for a final goodbye. He broke out with one singular goal: to get to Lake Charles, see Toni Jo one last time, or die trying to stop the executioner. He made it as far as Beaumont, Texas, just an hour's drive from the Louisiana border. He was so close he could practically smell the salt air of the Gulf. But the state had the entire region on total lockdown. They knew exactly where he was heading. A posse cornered him in Beaumont, and after a tense standoff, Cowboy was recaptured and thrown back into a cell under much tighter security. He had failed. The happily ever after that they murdered Joseph Calloway for, it was gone. While Cowboy was being hauled away back to the Walls, Lake Charles was facing a massive logistical nightmare. Louisiana had never executed a woman in the electric chair before. They didn't even have a female death row, and they certainly didn't have a permanent execution chamber equipped for her. The state solution was pure grit, mechanical and cold. They used a portable electric chair, a wooden throne of death on wheels named Gruesome Gertie. They didn't take Toni Jo to the chair. They loaded that chair onto a truck at the state penitentiary in Angela and drove it across the state. On the morning of November 28, they rolled Gruesome Gertie right into the basement of the Calcasieu Parish Courthouse. This wasn't a high-tech facility. It was a humid, cramped storage room filled with boilers and old files. It was a place for storage and boilers, now it was repurposed for a state-sanctioned killing. Well, the final hours were pure Southern Gothic. Toni Jo, she spent her last morning with a priest, but she also spent it with a hairdresser. Because for the electrodes to work, they had to shape a patch of her hair from the crown of her head and her right leg. This was the only time the Tiger Woman mask supposedly slipped. She didn't weep for Joseph Calloway, the salesman she murdered. She wept for her hair. She told the guards, quote unquote, "It's a heck of a way to start the day, isn't it?" So at noon, they led her into the basement. The room was crowded with witnesses, officials, doctors, and a few lucky reporters, all squeezed into the damp, low-ceiling space. They strapped her in with heavy leather belts. Well, when the executioner threw the big switch, the surge was so massive that the lights in the entire courthouse flickered and dimmed, a literal brownout caused by the 20,000 volts passing through her tiny body. She was pronounced dead at 12:12 p.m. But as employees in the building will tell you today, the basement didn't stay empty for long. So this is where the true crime ends and the ghost story begins. For decades, workers in that basement have reported things that they can't explain. It's not just flickering lights, though that happens constantly. It's electronics, copy machines starting by themselves, computers rebooting. But the most famous detail in that courthouse is, like I mentioned before, it's the smell. Multiple clerks and maintenance workers have reported a sudden, overwhelming scent of burning hair, the exact smell produced during electrocution. Others claim they smell a heavy floral perfume that doesn't belong in a modern office building. One story involves a maintenance worker who was alone in the basement at night. He heard a woman's voice whisper, "Help me," right in his ear. When he turned around, the room was empty, but the temperature, it dropped 10 degrees. People believe Toni Jo was stuck in the loop of those final moments, the terror of shaving her hair, the walk to the chair, and the final surge of all that electricity coursing through her body. Toni Jo, she was no saint. She was a murderer. But her execution left a stain on Lake Charles that it hasn't washed off. Whether it's residual energy or a spirit that refuses to leave the site of her death, the Tiger Woman remains the most grounded ghost story in Louisiana. And if you ever find yourself in the Calcasieu Parish Courthouse and you smell something like burning hair or old perfume, don't stop and look for the source. Just keep on walking. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really good stories in Louisiana. I know most people think Louisiana, they think New Orleans, the French Quarter. Everything's haunted in New Orleans. I mean, 3/4 of the French Quarter burned down in the 1800s. There's so many ghost stories in New Orleans. But Lake Charles, Shreveport, Baton Rouge. I think I did a show in Baton Rouge last year. There's so many. I mean, the South is just, there's so much folklore and ghost stories and really just fun stuff to draw from. Yeah, Louisiana is a great state for ghost stories. So as we wind down, make sure you guys check out the books on Amazon. I do have a new one coming out here in April 30th, Pistols at Red River. But the ones last year, Below the Trestle, the Popely Goat Monster. I'll actually be in Louisville again for that festival this year in October. Hex, the book about the voodoo doctor in New Orleans. That was a big hit last year. So, and also the ghost stories, Southern Ghost Stories, Downtown Nashville, Southern Ghost Stories, New Orleans. I'm talking about Louisiana. I've got a New Orleans book talking about places like St. Louis Cemetery, where Marie Laveau was buried. All kinds of ghost stories in New Orleans. So check out the books. Just go to Amazon, type in my name, Alan Searcy. They'll all pop up. And leave a review. Leave a review for the books. If you read one, those are great. Also the podcast. Go to Apple Podcast, Spotify. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review. Those help so much. I really appreciate you guys when you do that for me. So we wind down. Yeah, check back. I'll be back here on Tuesday and got some more fun ghost stories. And spring's almost here, and I'll be out touring, and I'm excited for it. So I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Check out the exclusive shirts from Monster City Madhouse, Gravestone, Rocktober, and Val Halloween. All that and much more at MonsterCityMadhouse.com.